So we can get clear on some of the terminology and whatnot and get an understanding of how our digestion works. I think we don't appreciate how influential it is on how we think, feel, move, recover, immune system and all that stuff. So first slides, look, the first digestion does start in the mouth. So it's really important when people tell you to chew your food. That's really important because the saliva we produce in our mouth produces enzymes, and that starts to break down in the food process before it actually gets into our stomach. And then the stomach's where most of the work is done in regards to breaking our food down. I think it's a really important factor that's totally in regards to stomach acid. I'm sure you're probably not doing it, but if you've heard of like antacids or protein pump inhibitors where people are taking them for heartburn, we want to try and avoid that because it's just inhibiting your stomach's ability to turn the food that we eat into what they call is chyme. And chyme is an interesting word. It just means it's from whole foods into tiny particles that then can be absorbed. So, and for that to happen, the stomach needs to be at a pH of 2 to 3. So really like hydrochloric acid, very acidic. And when we're taking antacids or protein pump inhibitors, that changes that level. So then we have food sitting in the stomach fermenting, which is what can cause gas and reflux to happen. So it's kind of counterintuitive for some people because they don't have enough stomach acid there can be other contributing factors that then they'll take something to counteract that acid, and then henceforth then the acid's not low enough in pH to actually break the food down. So it's just sitting there fermenting. And then we can get bacterial growth in the stomach. And then that's when we can start getting reflux and heartburn. And so that's something just to be aware of, especially if someone suggests to you, oh, just take an antacid, and then you start doing that on a regular basis. That's only bad things happen from that. So especially from long-term use of protein pump inhibitors, and that's just essentially stopping the production of acid in the stomach itself. From what the studies have shown now that have been doing it for so long, it leads to actually bowel cancer. So yeah. Anyway, that's probably not of a great concern to you ladies. So yeah, once the food in the stomach is broken down into tiny, tiny particles, it's then released into the small intestine. And that's where all the absorption happens. Again, the pH is quite important. So pancreas now releases both enzymes that help break down the food and then also releases bicarbonate soda. So we want to raise the pH level, because the stomach has a nice little mucosal lining that protects the cells from getting burnt from the hydrochloric acid. And now we need to change that pH of 3 back up to neutral around 6.5, 7. So you've got a pancreas that's now pumping out. So it's very like systematic, genius process, and everything kind of, once one step goes out of sync, then downstream effects can be really negative. So that's why I'm just running through this to give you an understanding of how important each step is in the process. So then the small intestine, depends on the person, is about 21, 2 or 3 feet long. So from basically almost from here to the wall. If we actually stretched out your small intestine, it's ridiculously long. Wow. And it has these tiny little finger-like projections called villi, and that allows a huge amount of surface area. And so all those tiny particles that the food's been broken down in the stomach can now get absorbed in the small intestine. And obviously, most of the absorption of nutrients should happen in the small intestine, and that's where it gets into the bloodstream and we get our vitamins and minerals, and that's how we should be functioning effectively. Then the undigested, especially fiber, so fruits, vegetables, there's soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. So the insoluble fiber stays intact. It adds bulk to your stool. It's what makes your digestive system keep moving systematically, nice and smoothly. And then that gets into the large colon, which we'll touch on next. So now we're moving down the system. So yeah, we're now out of that small intestine. You'll see all those interlocked winding tubes. That's your small intestine. Now we're into the large colon, and there's 3 sections to it. And this is where your microbiome mainly lives. So if you've heard of people talking about the microbiome, that is a huge diversity of bacteria and some fungus that live in your colon, because it's a perfect spot for them to live. It's in anaerobics, there's no oxygen, there's no light, so they thrive in those conditions. And what they're doing is they're feeding on that fiber. So fiber is very important, which I'm going to talk about soon. So that's why the recommended dietary guidelines stipulate that we should be having 2 servings of fruit a day, 6 servings of vegetables a day. And because that should get us to what the recommended dose is, 25 to 30 grams of fiber. I don't think that's quite enough, to be honest, but so what that is doing, so that fiber that hasn't been broken down, that is not absorbed in the small intestine, goes into that large intestine. or the large colon. And so now that's feeding those bacteria. Those bacteria love that fiber. It's their fuel sources. And then those bacteria produce all kinds of metabolites like short chain fatty acids. And those fatty acids are an energy source for you and for the cells of the GI tract. So the bacteria is very important, and if we have overgrowth of particular bacteria, that drives different cravings. It can also drive inflammation. They release different toxins as well, so they want to try and crowd out the environment and have a little overgrowth. And so that's why it's really important to have a diverse variety of food in your diet. So yeah, the reason now that we're kind of seeing, okay, I chew my food, it gets broken down in the stomach, but if I'm always having the same 5 to 7 foods in a week, and your diet's not very diverse. Now, when we get to the large colon, where the bacteria need all of those different, vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, grains, legumes, all of the different plant-based foods, there's not enough fuel for them to survive. And there's trillions of these little guys, and they need a fuel source. And if they don't get it, then they'll actually start eating the mucosal lining of your GI tract. So again, all the way down, there's a 1 to 2 millimeter thick of this think of it as it's a barrier basically between the inside and then into your system. So if there's not enough fiber and fuel for those bacteria to actually feed on, then they'll start feeding on your mucosal lining. These little mucins that make up the mucosal, they're like sugar molecules and they're like, sweet, we'll eat them. And then once they start doing that, then we get leaky gut syndrome, if you've heard of that. So essentially that mucosal lining should be very tight junctions. It should be nicely interlocked, and that should stop things from passing into the bloodstream from inside the small intestine or the large colon, and then into the bloodstream, and then when it gets taken around the body. If that mucosal lining starts breaking down, now we can get larger bacterias, pathogens passing into the bloodstream, and that causes systemic inflammation. And now we've got a problem. And I think that's a huge issue that society as a whole is dealing with when we hear about chronic inflammation. It's generally derived from your gut allowing that to pass into the bloodstream, and now we get an immune response. And when we get a systemic, constant immune response, because you've got a leaky gut or you've got inflammation in the gut, now you've got basically a low-grade immune response, which causes an inflammatory reaction, and now you've got inflammatory markers floating around the body causing you inflammation. And now that leads to diseases, and I think that's probably a big cause of chronic diseases that we see in society today. So that's a quick rundown from the top to bottom, and then obviously after the large colon, it passes into the anal canal, and then you poop it out. So that's a quick overview of how our GI tract works. So basically, the gut microbiome, it takes care of digestion, immune system, vitamin and nutrient production. So they also produce different, the microbiome itself, those little bacteria produce different metabolites like vitamin K, short chain fatty acids. They control inflammation. The barrier protection is really important, as I mentioned. That then affects mental and emotional health. If you're not eating well and we're not feeding the bacteria, and the bacteria is not producing even things like serotonin, which is really important for how you think and feel, and then metabolic regulation. So yeah, that's why I really harp on food is the fuel for those bacteria that then fuel you. So yeah, if you have a look on the top right corner there, the number of bacteria in your digestive tract outnumber our number of cells in our body, which is, when you think about it, pretty amazing that there's trillions of these little guys just living in there and trying to work alongside us. I mean, they over, let's just say, hundreds of thousands of years that we've, as humans, have evolved, that microbiome has developed with us to work commensal or work alongside us, because we're a lovely spot for them to live, and then they help us out with producing different metabolites or things that then we can use to be fueled better, live better, think better. So it's very much a beneficial relationship between us and our bacteria. So this is just two species so you've got Bacteroidetes and then Firmicutes or Firmicutes, and so they need to be in a nice ratio. And what we've seen in some studies is with a highly processed Western diet that we get with, hopefully we're not eating here, but that people commonly eat, that's low in fiber, low in diversity, we see a drop in Firmicutes because they love to feed on that stuff. And then when we see a drop in those Firmicutes or Firmicutes, as some people like to call them, then we're not producing short chain fatty acids, and that fuels, again, provides you with energy, provides energy for the cells in your GI tract. We see an imbalance, and then that leads to depression-like symptoms. So one study showed that a drop in firmicutes led that group to those patients having depression. So I was looking at a study more recently, and they they brought people in with depression, and then they did a microbiome test and saw what bacteria they had, and they had about 73% accuracy that the researchers found by just looking at the bacteria, they determined whether that person would have depression or not. So we're getting close to seeing what species are really influential on how our mood and our emotions and how we think. So
how quickly can you change that
though? Yeah, great question. I would generally say it could take months to rebuild a diverse and robust microbiome, but I think within days, to be honest, like when you start introducing new foods or greater diversity, or you start pulling things out, we're going to see changes within days, basically. And then to see long-term change, especially after antibiotics, I think the antibiotics is where it takes generally months to rebuild a nice, diverse microbiome, which is why I'm a big advocate for only using antibiotics when absolutely necessary, because they are so detrimental to your microbiome, to your gut health, to how you function, and it can take a long time to rebuild that, and it can be a long-term consequence for just taking, because I think I've got a cold. And so you've got to be really, if you're going to your doctor and he's just going to write you out a course of antibiotics, question why. Do I need this? Is there anything else I could be doing from a nutritional or a health perspective to avoid that? Because there are, especially if he's not going to recommend that you do any post-antibiotic therapy. So if we take a probiotic, or there's some Saccharomyces boulardii, some other things that I would recommend that you would take alongside a course or directly once you finish your course to try and rebuild a nice healthy gut. And a lot of GPs will not, or just do not understand the importance of doing that post-antibiotic treatment therapy to try and rebuild a nice healthy microbiome. So just something to be aware of. Yeah, so as I said, like implications of a dysfunctional gut-brain axis. So when your gut's not working well, obviously that affects how you think and how you feel. It leads to mental health disorders, cognitive impairment, weakened immune system, and physical health issues. So that's why it's so influential to try and make sure we're maintaining a good healthy gut and we're eating a lovely diverse diet. Any questions on how that kind of interacts in the gut-brain axis? All make sense so far? Excellent. Okay, so now I'm just going to quickly run over 3 nutritional strategies that I like to recommend to people to try and optimize their gut microbiome, or just gut health from top to bottom. So the first one is fiber. And I believe that fiber is essential and underrated in our diet today, because so much of the food that we eat is processed, and generally when they process it, they pull the fiber out. So as you see there's actually been a long-term social experiment going on now for almost a decade called the American Gut Project. And what they wanted to do is just get anyone who wanted to do a stool sample to do that, and then they would send it off to the lab, and basically they started tracking what the stool sample told them against their diary that they're keeping. So they're trying to correlate again what relates to a better, healthier, diverse microbiome. And it was what it seems like, from 11,000 odd people, that the greater the diversity of fiber, so not the actual amount of fiber, like I was saying before, that the Australian Dietary Guidelines recommend that we have 30 grams of fiber a day. That didn't seem to make the difference, but the diversity, so having up to 30 different plant-based sources a week seemed to be the winning ingredient to having a lovely, diverse, healthy, robust, commensal, supporting of you microbiome. So that's something to be aware of each week now. When you go home after today, start thinking about, okay, how many have I had 1 or 2 bits of fruit today? So there's 2 different fiber sources. If you're having vegetables with dinner, so that you might have 3 or 4 vegetables. So when if you can have, let's say, 6 or 7 different fiber sources a day, over the week, you're going to hit that 30 mark pretty easily. So yeah, but that includes nuts, grains, seeds, even the spices. So yeah, anything plant-based will aid in developing a lovely microbiome. I think that's so, when I found that information, it really just reinforced why I was pushing fiber, and then really understood that diversity is more important than amount. So, because a lot of people go, can I take a fiber supplement? Which you can. I'm not against taking a fiber supplement, but if you can eat your fiber, that's a much better way to get it. So that's my first strategy. And then number 2 and 3, we want to, if you can, incorporate some fermented foods. Now, you can do this at home. Obviously, yogurt is a fermented food, so I'm all for yogurt. You can do coconut, dairy. I've even just started fermenting my own yogurt. If you wanted to try something different at home, you could try that. You can ferment your own vegetables too, in just a brine, salt, basic stuff, spices, or you can just buy it now in lovely pre-made kimchi, whatever you want to do, it's now readily available. So at home we have a variety of just fermented stuff from the Whole Life Pharmacy, and it's delicious, and you can add it into salads, on my burgers, wraps, rolls, wherever you want to do it. And now we're getting more bacteria that's already fermented within that food group, and now we're going to increase our diversity and feed the microbiome with fiber. So that's an easy one, I think, for people to just, when you're at the shop next and you see a little jar of fermented food, pick one that could be beetroot, it could be carrots, onions, it could be cabbage. Pick one and try it and see how you go with it. It's my recommendation is don't try everything at once, just try one at a time and see how you can introduce it into your foods. And then the last one is just minimize gut disruptors. So that's ultra-processed foods, excessive sugar, alcohol, artificial sweeteners. For some people that can be caffeine in excess. In general, I think 1 to 3 cups seems fine for most people. So I've got nothing against coffee, obviously. I think it has a lot of health benefits. So yeah, just excess. And then, yeah, if we can reduce antibiotic use, as that last one down there, and if you do have a course of antibiotics, as I said, try to follow that up with a course of probiotics and reintroduce a lot more fiber into your diet. That'll also boost your immune system and help you recover better. So that's my top 3 suggestions for improving your gut and microbiome health. So that's kind of the quick, short over the gut. And then if you do have any gut issues, which no one has any gut problems at the moment. If we did there are some supplements and natural treatments that we can use to support repair, reduce inflammation. If you've got any like heartburn or stuff, then there's some great ingredients out there to help with digestion and help that repair process. So they're just a few of my favorites. And we would talk about those before we'd implement them based on your symptoms. So there's stuff out there to support a healthy gut. Look, these are some examples of some pre-made products that have all those ingredients in them, which you can get from a supplement store, you can get it from pharmacies. You can do microbiome testing, as I was saying, like that American Gut Project. They do microbiome testing, obviously, and that tells us a lot. So if you ever are unsure about what's going on in your gut, then microbiome testing is a great way to discover what's going on from the inside out and not just be guessing. We're on to sleep. Okay, done. So that's a quick overview of gut health, nutritional strategies to try and improve gut function. So any questions on that one?